Chapter 1. The Weight of Winter. The following day, frost sketched messages over the windows of the Whitmore house as it leaned into the frigid wind, its wooden siding gone gray with age. Built by Nathan's grandfather in 1868 during the prosperity that ensued after the Civil War, the house persevered against the ashen sky, its hand-hewn beams and walnut floors bearing witness to 3 generations of artisans. Within, a fire burned in the stone hearth, fighting the cold that seeped through the thin walls. Last year's newspapers plugged the worst gaps, and a pair of Nathan's damp work boots sat steaming by the flames. The fire's heat penetrated the rooms, in stark contrast to the chilliness that existed between Nathan and Clara, man and wife. A distance measured not in feet, but in unspoken aspirations. Clara's steps faltered at the base of the attic stairs. Up there, wrapped in the muslin and tucked behind the eaves, waited a last gift from Nathan's mother, Beatrice, a wooden doll that Nathan's father had once carved. "For your own little ones," she'd whispered on Clara's wedding day, pressing it into her hands. While Nathan retreated further into his workshop each day, that wrapped bundle carried their silent grief. Clara descended the stairs, each step burdened with the memory. In the kitchen, she poured her morning tea, the accustomed ritual doing little to calm her racing mind. Steam rose from the china cup bearing tiny chips from years of use. The spoon clinked against the porcelain as she stirred in a spoonful of honey, the sound stark. Through the window, she studied the snow angel, unassuming yet striking, mirroring the pieces Nathan once created before doubt stole his conviction. He sat at the kitchen table, the morning paper unfolded before him. His coffee had grown cold, untouched. The accustomed scent of sawdust clung to his flannel shirt. However, it was different. Plain lumber, rather than the rich cedar and cherry woods he once constructed into works of art. "I thought we could go into the village later," Clara said, her voice hesitant, resembling a sparrow testing its wings after a storm. She smoothed her smock apron, her hands fidgeting at the button front, a nervous habit she'd developed. "The church is hosting a food drive, and the Sullivans asked about you. And Mrs. Smith keeps the prayer bench you made in her parlor. Says she feels closer to God whenever she kneels on it." Nathan's dark eyes met Clara's before returning to the paper, the lines around his mouth growing more pronounced. "I've got work in the shop. The Sullivans need their kitchen cabinets by week's end." "Plain cabinets," Clara said softly, more to herself than to him. "When you once made pieces that caused people to stop and stare." With a short, impatient breath, he crinkled the newspaper with a deliberate press of his fingers, the headline obscured by a coffee ring. Clara flattened the wrinkled chronicle, its bold black headlines announcing church suppers and selectmen's meetings. She focused on a notice at the bottom. "Railroad officials visit Evergreen Hollow." She flipped the page, not yet knowing how significant those words would prove to be. Nathan adjusted the second large sheet. News, perhaps? Or reassurance in the uneven black type, contrasting against the gray newsprint. Yet his eyes didn't focus on the print. "We can't eat admiration," he replied. His tone was the resolve of a man attempting to contain his frustration. His words, however true, settled on her spirit, as frigid as the outside air. She carried her teacup to the window, seeking comfort in the pristine white landscape. Her snow angel stood there, a testament to last night's hour of faith, or perhaps desperation. In the morning light, it continued to hold her gaze, similar to how Nathan's finest pieces once drew every eye in a room, those burled oak vessels with their swirling patterns, or the cherry wood tables that seemed to float on delicate legs. Maybe you can take a break. She tried again, her tone gentler, tender as a bruise. The church would appreciate your talent for their new display cabinets. They need several sets, an exquisite offering for God's house. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the aged floorboards. Clara, I'm not sure what you want from me. I make useful things now. It's honest work. Cabinets are useful. No. Nathan, there's honesty in beauty too. The same honesty I see in every sunrise, every frost pattern, every snow angel's wing. God's truth isn't solely in utility. Her gaze dropped to the table, where varnish had worn away, the imperfections as familiar as the arguments that always circled back to this subject. Plainness doesn't fail. Past shame colored Nathan's voice. Plainness doesn't make promises they can't keep. The sting of the ensuing quiet blindsided her, relentless as a raging storm. She swiveled, hiding the tears that threatened to spill. Beyond the window rose Evergreen Hollow's expensive colonial revival homes, where his younger brother, Thomas's plain furniture, had sealed the void that Nathan's artistry had abandoned. Today, the village appeared less picturesque, less remarkable. Clara couldn't turn away, akin to watching Thomas's projects elicit whispers at the county fair. His hope chests and kitchen tables favored the homes of farmers and small business owners. When she taught at the one-room schoolhouse, pride and jealousy mingled whenever she went by the mercantile store showcasing his latest work. Nathan grabbed his long tweed overcoat from its peg, pausing with his hand on the front door latch. Not everyone is meant for grand things, Clara, he said, as if he were reading her mind. Sometimes we must accept our place in life. Your place, she said, was never in the shadows of ordinary work. God gave you a gift. I was mistaken to believe that gift was enough. The wooden door closed with a strong finality, leaving Clara alone with her cooling tea and the burden of her husband's surrender. He trudged toward his workshop, past the snow angel whose wings seemed to reach after him, a reminder of all they'd lost. Not only a superior furniture shop or the admiration of society, but the core of his previous belief, his faith in the divine purpose of magnificence. Clara cleared the dishes, scraping off the last bits of honey bread and jam, her movements mechanical and practiced. The routine steadied her hands. 3 years ago, they'd shared hour-long breakfasts, planning which exotic woods to order for Nathan's next creation. Now, even breathing the same air was like navigating a minefield of shattered dreams. As she dried the last ceramic plate, she glanced at the coffee pot, still half full. Nathan had hardly touched his cup. Despite everything, some habits died hard for her, worrying whether he was taking care of himself, especially when he worked with such a single-minded focus on pieces that drained rather than fed his soul. Before she talked herself out of it, Clara poured the coffee into a fresh mug. She grabbed her wool coat from its peg, tugged on her scuffed leather boots, and stepped outside. She drew in winter-cleaned air, tasting of snow and wood smoke. She had worn the path to Nathan's workshop. How many times had she walked this in happier days, bringing him coffee, watching in wonder as his hands coaxed splendor from raw lumber, sharing visions about the pieces he would create for the finest homes in 3 counties. She paused at the entrance, her hand hovering above the grainy wood. Through the frost-rimmed window, she glimpsed him, hunched over the workbench, the light outlining the curve of his shoulders and the focused tilt of his head. The sight of him stirred memories. Nathan, lost in the joy of creation, moving with the confidence of one touched by divine inspiration. Drawing a deep breath, She knocked. "Please come inside." His voice was muffled, distracted. She opened the door. The workshop air was dense with the smell of varnish. His workshop spread before her, a museum of his former days, fine chisels gathering dust in their leather rolls, the special jigs for dovetailing replaced by rougher tools. A single shaft of light shone on the curls of recently cut pine shavings, so different from the rich mahogany and walnut scraps that once scattered over the floor. He didn't look up from the piece he was sanding, its surface plain and unadorned. "I'm working on a new commission," he said. "A couch for the Hendersons." "I brought you more coffee." She set the mug on a clear corner of his bench. "And—" She hesitated, then pressed on, reaching beneath her coat into her apron pocket. "I found this while cleaning yesterday." She placed a black and white photograph beside the mug. In the image, they stood side by side, Nathan in a tailored three-piece suit with a neatly knotted cravat, his top hat held under one arm. Clara wore a fitted wool coat with a fur-trimmed collar, a wide-brimmed hat embellished with a green ribbon, and gloves buttoned at the wrist. The pride in their expressions was unmistakable as they posed outside their freshly painted storefront. Past the front window was a magnificent bed frame, the one that had won him recognition at the statewide. His hand stopped as he glanced at the photograph. "Clara, do you remember what you said that day?" she asked. "You said that God gave you a gift and you wouldn't bury it." He set down the sandpaper, not meeting her eyes. "You're speaking of a time before I understood the cost of pride." "Yours wasn't pride, Nathan. Yours was faith. Faith in your God-given talent." "See where faith led us?" He gestured around the workshop, with its rough-sawn rafters and dirt floor, so different from his impressive showroom. The pot-bellied stove in the corner barely pushed back the cold, and stacks of plain pine boards leaned against the wall. "From a thriving family business to—" He shook his head. "At least I can provide an honest living." She followed his gaze to the rough orders for kitchen cabinets and farm tables chalked on a board, replacing the delicate sketches that once inspired his exceptional pieces. "You provided before," she said. "You brought splendor into people's lives, made them see the glory of God in every piece you created." His dark eyes held the same lost expression she'd seen the day he'd covered his workbench with canvas and stowed away his finest tools. Haunted. "Lavishness doesn't provide a meal, Clara," he replied. "Neither does denying who you really are." She touched a chisel hanging on the wall. "These tools are part of you. You see the divine gifts in every piece of wood. That's not only a skill, that's a calling." "Not anymore." His flat response stuck to her skin like a splinter. She pressed her arms close, as if she could hold in the warmness his words had stolen. "I need to prepare for the food collection," she said. "Mrs. Evans mentioned she'd be there. She still tells everyone about how the memory tree box you made helped her through her husband's passing. That's provision too, Nathan. Feeding souls instead of bodies." He picked up the sandpaper, the rough sound occupying the space where agreement should have been. In profile, he resembled an abandoned sculpture, glory trapped in common wood, waiting to be freed. Later that morning, Clara pulled on her coat, its faded fabric patched at the elbows and worn at the cuffs. A plain woolen scarf, knitted in the last months when her mother, Helen, still had the strength to teach her, was wound snugly around her neck, and a pair of thin gloves barely shielded her fingers from the chill. Her boots let in the occasional prickle of cold through the cracks in their soles, but they were the only pair she owned. The air bit at her cheeks, crisp and clean as pristine linen, the sky pale and indifferent. Her gaze flicked to the garden where the angel stood, its shape half hidden under a recent layer of snow. More an impression than a figure, yet somehow, in its imperfect form, the angel offered a sense of peace. With a soft sigh, Clara began the familiar walk into the village. White powder covered the narrow dirt road, compacted by wagons and the cautious steps of neighbors trudging through. The faint clink of horses' harnesses sounded, merging with the rustle of bare branches whipped by the wind. Evergreen Hollow was surprisingly quiet, its modest single-family homes and brick post office clustered around the central square like best friends leaning into one another. The scrape of brooms and shovels signaled that a few shopkeepers were clearing their stoops. The general store's striped awning sagged under the snow, and the bakery's chimney puffed out plumes of smoke, carrying with it a trace of bread rising in a warm oven. She passed the vacant storefront that had once housed Whitmore Fine Furnishings. Years ago, hand-carved bureaus and polished tables crammed the space. Now the windows reflected only a bleak January morning. The removal of the sign resulted in rusted hooks and pale discoloration on the clapboard siding. The large display, dim and coated with a layer of frost, bore the faded outline of gilt lettering, a ghostly trace of what had once been. Resembling a photograph left too long in the sun, its brilliance had dimmed, yet the image remained. Her gloved hand brushed against the wrought iron railing of the store. The sight tugged at her, equal parts nostalgia and longing, the remnants of a life brimming with promise. She had stood behind those very windows with Nathan, their fingers entwined. Back then, they had believed in a future as solid and unyielding as the oak dining sets they sold. But the relentless march of time, like the winter wind, had worn them down. Shivering, she clutched her coat closer and scanned the street. A few blocks off was the boarding house, an unassuming two-story building tucked on the border of the village, a stopover for travelers, workers, and business people who didn't need or couldn't afford a hotel, offering them basic shelter with an air of detachment. Evergreen Hollow, for all its struggles, the shuttered saloon since Prohibition, the empty storefronts vacated by merchants seeking a more profitable life in the city, held on to a firm resilience. Farmers bundled against the weather-loaded sacks of grain onto wagons, while the chime of the blacksmith's hammer resounded through the square. Modern conveniences, electric lights, and paved roads were unavailable for many, and villagers clung to their traditions, refusing to accept the tide of change. The church was at the center, its white steeple extending toward the sky as a finger pointing to heaven. Clara dawdled when she reached the fellowship hall, next to the main church, clutching her bag of canned goods intended as a contribution. She steadied her nerves. The scent of coffee and pastries wafted through the gap beneath the entrance, along with the steady hum of conversation that perpetually faltered whenever she appeared. She stepped inside, and the chatter continued. Women sorted donations, their hands busy even as their eyes flickered toward her, then away. The hall was ordinary but welcoming, its sturdy wooden beams blackened by coal smoke. Long trestle tables stretched along the room, the surfaces nicked and soothed by countless potlucks and gatherings. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, radiating heat. She inhaled the smell of burning coal and the tang of damp wool from coats piled near the entryway. Handmade quilts and scripture verses stitched in bleached thread lined the walls, serving as reminders of the sewing circle that had met there for decades. Despite the chill seeping through the drafty windows, the room murmured with women's voices and an occasional laugh. Mrs. Williams studied Clara over the donation boxes. Thomas's new display cabinet looks well in the church hall, doesn't it?" Her voice carried just far enough for other women to hear. "So practical." Clara busied herself with arranging canned goods, fighting a wave of nausea she wasn't able to explain. "Nathan has a new commission," she said, keeping her tone even. "A couch for the Hendersons." The sorting hands around her stilled. Mrs. Sullivan's eyebrows lifted. "The Hendersons can afford any craftsman in the state." The unspoken comparison to Thomas, Nathan's brother, hung pervasively in the air. "Such a shame," Mrs. Adams muttered, not quite under her breath. "All that talent." She shook her head, arranging sugar cookies on a plate with too much force. "Though these days, folks want something that'll last, not just look pretty." "Clara, over here." Eleanor Clemens waved from the far side of the hall, her red scarf bright as a cardinal against their winter-washed world. She proceeded through the volunteers, her arms laden with boxes. "I was hoping you'd come today. The deacons were discussing more display cabinets for the Sunday school room." Clara managed a smile, grateful for her friend's pleasantness as she set down her canned beans and corn. "Do you need an extra pair of hands?" "Always." Eleanor's green eyes brightened with understanding, contrasting with the fine lines etched around them. Her silver white hair, secured under a crocheted cap, glinted in the light. She studied Clara's face. "First, you need a hug." The kindness in Eleanor's embrace nearly undid Clara's careful composure, and she blinked back tears. "Thank you. It's been a long morning." "I saw Thomas at the Mercantile yesterday," Eleanor said. Clara studied the maple cabinet Thomas had donated, all practical lines and squared corners. Where Nathan would have allowed the wood to sing its own song, Thomas had imposed order, each joint precise, each angle true, built to serve rather than to stir the soul. The sight prompted a bittersweet pang in her chest, remembering how Nathan's pieces once drew collectors from every region of New England so they could run their fingers over the flowing curves and remark on his artistry. Clara nodded, although Thomas's solid workmanship felt as if another option was closing on Nathan's dreams. "Thomas mentioned the family business is struggling without Nathan's superb pieces," Eleanor said. "Thomas has his own masterpieces to tend to, I assume," Clara replied, each word brittle as thin ice. Inwardly, she chastised herself. She wasn't a bitter woman. Was she? "Lord, grant me mercy," she whispered. "Help me relinquish this anger before it changes me completely." "Nathan is a genuine artist," Eleanor continued, as if talking to herself. "Such a shame to waste a natural talent." Clara stooped to stack cans on the shelves. "Nathan believes he was wrong to pursue that kind of work. Practical pieces are more virtuous somehow." "Virtuous?" Eleanor shook her head. "Tell that to King Solomon, who decorated God's temple with the finest skill he could command, or to Moses, who called upon gifted artisans, overflowing with God's Spirit, to create golden lampstands, woven tapestries of fine linen and alabaster vessels, all with such care and devotion that they became anointed symbols of holiness in the tabernacle." A small knot tightened in Clara's stomach. "I wish Nathan saw it that way." "He did once," Eleanor reminded, "and he will again." God's gifts don't expire, Clara. They wait for us to be bold enough to use them. Before Clara could respond, Reverend Josiah Pembroke's resonant voice projected across the hall. "Good day, ladies. We've got plenty of food for our community dinners. What a blessing to serve such a generous God." His cheerful tone brought joy, as a well-worn hymnal. Yet, as she peered out the glass toward her solitary rooftop, the grief in her heart remained steadfast as a sad song. In his workshop, Nathan's hand moved methodically over the rough surface of a plank of wood, studying its intentional plainness. The coffee Clara had brought sat untouched, losing heat as readily as the space between them. The window framed her snow angel, formed as though a child's hands tried to capture a breath of heaven, a blessing too divine for mortal grasp. The snowflakes that clung to its edges sparkled in a ray of sunlight, ethereal and transient, resembling the aspirations he'd once cherished. He picked up the photograph she'd left. There they were, both so young, overflowing with hope and determination. Before the dream of his business had crumbled under the bulk of unfulfilled commitments. Before his high society client had dismissed Nathan as nothing more than an upstart. Before he discovered that no matter how exquisite a piece might be, perfection couldn't withstand the rude twist of reality. He ran a hand over his face, trying to wipe away the memory of that day, the day the governor's wife's harsh words cut deeper than any failure. It was then that he realized artistry, the high society version, wasn't enough. The carpenter's hammer felt heavy as he resumed, losing himself in the cadence of manual creation. The pine boards yielded clean, straight lines under his tools, nothing comparable to the wild grain of cherry wood he'd once coaxed into waves and wings. Clara's words resonated in his mind. Yours isn't a skill. Yours is a calling. His gaze fixed on the well-honed chisels, their handles molded to fit his grip through countless hours of passionate labor. In the window's reflection, he imagined his father's face, sensed his presence, even though he'd since passed. His father had been a tall, broad-shouldered man, his dark hair streaked with silver, his features as keen and inflexible as the tools he wielded with such precision. His eyes, a piercing brown, had seen through every lie and flaw, entailed Nathan's recollections as an unforgiving witness. He'd borne his age like a mantle, the creases on his forehead deepening with each year. And his voice, Nathan still heard it clearly, gruff and clipped, with an edge of authority that never allowed for dissent. "Pride goeth before a fall, son," he'd once said. The pronouncement, a critical judgment, settled into Nathan's chest like a stone. As the winter sun began its descent, both Clara and Nathan worked in their separate spaces, she among the community at the church, he in the solitude of his workshop. Between them stood a snow angel, poised to endure the spring's thaw when it came, a testament to the gifts that survive even through the coldest seasons of doubt.